my presentation as why architecture needs a strategy, because one of the things that we are starting to see across the world is on this slide, which is the rise of complexity. Right? I mean, if you talk to the person who came up with the concept of enterprise architecture, John Zachman, he clearly says, and I completely agree with him, is that the reason why you do any kind of architecture is basically to manage complexity. Right? If you're building a dog house for your pet dog, which is just outside the backyard, you obviously won't be hiring an architect, right? But if you're building the Type A 101, then you need an architect, or probably you need 10 architects to do that. So organizations, enterprises are large, complex entities which require, architecting. And this is something that is not common in the management parlance, because what we are starting to see, and something that the previous speaker also alluded to, is that we are living in an era of hyper-connectedness, and a lot of it is being enabled by technology. However, what you will see is that people who have a little bit of management background, you will see that our management theories, Jerry was talking about our MBA programs. I'm not sure how the MBA program is here. But typically what happens in the MBA programs, the kind of management theories that are taught, they were actually designed in the 17th and 18th century, industrial engineering era. And they still continue to exist like that. It has not changed. Basic management theory has not changed. The way organizations operate actually has not changed. Now, earlier speaker was talking about the Fortune 100, right? Fortune 100 ranking, right? So Fortune is a business magazine which ranks the best organizations in the world I think every 2 years, or maybe it's every year. The important point is, so it's a Fortune 100, which means it's the top 100 companies. 66 of the top 100 companies who were ranked in 1980 don't exist anymore. They are out of business. That's the reason. They are unable to deal with complexity. Today we go gaga over Facebook, Google, blah, blah, and all that stuff. Possibly in 10 years, none of these companies will exist. They will not survive. Some will, some will not, right? Do you remember that we used to have a company called Sun Microsystems? Netscape, forgot, right? Nokia, right? Kodak, large companies, huge companies, they were trendsetters in their area. The reason why they couldn't survive is not because technology, is because they could not deal with complexity. Okay? And why complexity is becoming such a big factor in the world is basically because the way technology is changing. What you see here is primarily, how people interact with large organizations, which could be governments, which could be other enterprises. Typically, there was a situation in the 17th and 18th century where the large organizations, including governments, would pass on certain products and services, and there would be no competition, and people would accept it. To a point where, in the first generation thing, there is some feedback coming in from the person. So this is basically the first generation. The second generation kind of people and organization, what is happening is here. There is this large organization, which could be government, which could be large enterprises who have their products and services. However, people on their own are interacting and making a decision whether to buy a product or a service. Okay? Many times that the large organization here would come up with an advertisement campaign saying that this is the best service they could deliver, this is the best product they could deliver. However, here are the people who come and say on Twitter saying that this product is lousy, immediately the sales of the product comes down. So this advertisement campaign has virtually no impact on the performance of the product or service. Now this kind of interaction, so look at how complex this interaction is. The problem with current organizations is that this organization here is they are not in control of this interaction, including governments. Unlike this. I'm in total control of what is going on versus this. And that is being enabled by technology. Jerry was talking about SMAC. Definitely that is enabling some of that change. So you can see how in the past 50 to 100 years, we have become more complex. The entire ecosystem has become more complex. And that is bringing in huge change in the way organizations and the way enterprises need to operate. There was a survey done, all right, and this is the key findings about complexity. So you can see the number one issue is complexity is a major issue for enterprises globally, nothing specific to government. 94% of CEOs, executives, believe that managing complexity is the key to success. Level of complexity has risen in the past 2 years, okay? And executives, top executives, actually expect it to rise even further. Many reasons, I'll show you what those reasons are. About 60% of the complex enterprises have achieved mixed success in tackling complexities. The good thing about complexity is if you understand what ecosystem you're operating in, you can make it into a competitive advantage, because once you're complex, once your ecosystem is complex, nobody else can replicate you, nobody else can copy you. It is very easy to build a device which operates like an iPhone. It is very difficult to replicate the ecosystem that Apple has created. Okay? Complexity is exposing enterprises to new and more dangerous risks. Nearly 60% of enterprises have an enterprise architecture that may be adding to the complexity. Today we are talking about enterprise architecture, so that was the point here. New ways and skills are needed to address opportunities, challenges emerging as a result of rising complexity. So we'll see what that new way is through the kind of findings that I've done over the past 15 years in the public sector. Now, I'm assuming some of you are not aware what enterprise architecture is all about. The way I define enterprise architecture in one of my books published in 2012 was this. Enterprise architecture is defined as the ongoing process of building the ability to manage complexity with the pivotal goal of creating and sustaining coherent and future-ready enterprises. Coherent enterprises, very similar to what alignment Jerry was talking about, and future-ready is because organizations have to be ready for future, things that you cannot anticipate. However, should bad things happen, you should be able to respond. So that's how I define enterprise architecture. This idea went on to become a paper in Harvard Business Review in 2014. So that's the paper. If you have access to HBR, you can download this paper to understand what coherence actually means. All right? If you don't know what enterprise architecture consists of, in my view, it consists of these 6 blocks. It definitely consists of policy and strategy, which is what we are going to talk about today, understanding the strategy and policy of the organization, because it sets the direction for the enterprise. Followed by the business architecture, which focuses on the operationalization of that strategy through capabilities and processes and products and services. The reason I differentiate between services and products and capabilities and processes are because capabilities and processes provide an inward-oriented view of your business. Services and products provide an outside-in view, an outward-oriented view of your business. Kodak is a perfect example. Kodak was a Six Sigma company. They had the best technology, film technology in the world. They had a great capability, they had a great process. So where did they fail? Any inputs? They had the wrong product. Right? The way you compete with Microsoft Office is not by building a better typewriter. Right? Did you know that we used to have something called typewriters 30, 40 years back? So you don't build a better typewriter and say, I'm going to compete with MS Office. You might have a great process, you might have great capabilities, but if your service and product is wrong, you will not survive the market. All right? So that's business architecture. The definition is very simple. It's the reason we do what we do, the people we serve, and the outcomes we seek. What are your results that you're targeting? Now that business architecture, which is executing the strategy of the organization, needs to be enabled by technology. We have the data, the application, and the technology architecture. As Jerry was saying, some of this element can definitely go onto the cloud. That's besides the point. You don't want to do it internally because it is not your core skill. That is perfectly fine. However, you have to address that issue. That's why those blocks are on the picture. Now, if you see, the entire picture looks like a house, and we all know in house, for a strong house to exist, you need a strong foundation of architecture governance. What that means is you can have all the architecture in place. However, if they are not interconnected and they are not coherent, the entire enterprise architecture will fall flat. So that's a quick summary of what enterprise architecture is all about. So in my previous slide, I gave you the definition, and these are the 6 blocks. This is not a full course on enterprise architecture. I'll stop here. All right? The thing that we have to keep in mind is how do you architect a connected enterprise, connected government, which is what I'm going to cover in the next few slides. So here is another definition. What is a system? System is defined as a set of interrelated things encompassed by a permeable boundary interacting with one another and an external environment, forming a complex but unitary whole and working towards a common overall goal. The interesting thing about this definition is I can replace the word system with enterprise, and the definition will still hold good. This is what organizations do, right? They are a set of interrelated things. You have departments, divisions, lines of business, right? Whatever it is, who interact with one another, right? And an external environment who could be your customers, your suppliers, your regulators. They form a complex unitary whole. However, they all have to work towards a common goal. Okay? However, systems are characterized by 4 key things, which is extremely important in the current era. That's the reason I said why complexity is so important in today's world. Number 1, systems are diverse. You cannot expect everybody to be like you. People are different, organizations are different, different parts of the organizations are different. You have to respect it. Number 2, they are interdependent, like we work in a team, right? We are all dependent on one another. You do my work, I do your work, we help each other succeed. Same thing with organizations and enterprises. It's ambiguous. One of the key characteristics of enterprises is that you will not have all the answers. That's the difference between an architect and an engineer. An engineer needs all the answers in black and white so that an item can be built. Whether that item is a car or a plane or a bridge or a flyover, it doesn't matter. There is no room for ambiguity in engineering. Architects have to work with ambiguous outputs. You will not have all the answers for you to do the enterprise architecture. And flux. Enterprises change. They are dynamic entities. The difference between a building like a Type A 101 and an enterprise is that unless you're watching a Harry Potter movie, enterprises don't fly and change, buildings don't fly and change on their own. It stays the same. Enterprises do, right? You go and do the architecture, enterprises are still functioning, which means they are dynamic, they are changing, they are operating. That's the reason they are called as complex adaptive systems. Enterprises are complex. I've already introduced that topic. Adaptive, they have to change, and they are systems. Okay? Now, how many of you are familiar with systems thinking, systems dynamic? Okay, that's fine. So what this slide actually shows you are the key areas of systems thinking, system dynamic. And the reason why I typically use it for enterprise architecture and strategic thinking is because it gives you a holistic view of what could be the impact of the strategy you come up with. Okay, and I'm going to use that in the government case study. Now, I'm assuming that most of you don't have a government background, right? Government or public sector background, you have never done any work in that area. So there is this concept called whole of government paradigm in the, which is shown here, whole of government paradigm. What this talks about are the 6, 7 dimensions that are important to come up with the next generation of government, which is basically an enterprise but focused on a specific sector or a specific area. Number 1 is governments need to be citizen-centric, which means your services and products have to be what the citizens actually want, right? There is always a scope for common infrastructure and interoperability. What that means is there could be a lot of standardization at the technology architecture level. You saw that block earlier. There is always a need for governance, which means bureaucracy has to understand that they serve the people. They are public servants. There must be a reason why we use the word public servants, right? Because this is taxpayers' money, so the government governance is important. Multiple agencies, ministries, departments have to come together to provide an end-to-end service, so that's where the networking model comes in. And talking about collaboration, it is important to include the citizens in all the matters. And finally, it's important to have a transparent and open government. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of all of these 7 dimensions, but the areas that are important are shown in the slides, and the slides are given to you, I think, as a printout. Now, from a government perspective, how does transformation happen? Typically, it starts with strategic planning. So if you remember the roof of the picture, there's some budgeting going on there, some policy advice, identify the KPIs. So that's where the performance management happens. Set up a program for developing the architecture, set up the governance, understand what the parameters are, do the architecture, do the improvement of the service delivery, take the support of the cabinet, do the government communication. Now, the important point is a lot of people think enterprise architecture is done to build better IT systems. You see that building better IT systems is not even on this chart. Basically, it is to improve service delivery, government service delivery. Okay, and that's the reason I'm using the word transformation. Like Jerry was talking about transformation, this is big change. All right? Okay, now let's see how organizations adopt enterprise architecture. Before that, I'll just define the term government enterprise architecture. So earlier I showed you the definition of enterprise architecture, which is the generic term. This is government enterprise architecture. It is a mission-focused approach and a framework to galvanize the whole of government ecosystem by transcending boundaries between ministries and departments and agencies for designing and delivering services in a coordinated, efficient, and equitable manner, right, that citizens demand. Basically, the idea is to get to the goal of connected government. So that's the technical definition. What does it mean? It means moving from here. Now you can see the difference to here. All right, you can see the silos here very clearly. Departmental silos, they could be ministries, departments, agencies, doesn't matter. There are no silos here, but it becomes very citizen-centric. So that's the transformation journey. However, to make that journey from here to here, governments have to go through a lot of strategic thinking. They have to understand how the governments are organized. They have to understand what are the pluses, what are the minuses, and therefore come up with a strategy to make that transformation happen. And this is not about technology at all. It's virtually irrelevant. Technology is virtually irrelevant. All right? So let's see how the journey happens. I'll show you snapshots in about 10 different stages from moving from here to here. Okay. So transformation. Typically, governments start with transformation because they become more and more complex. So this is a system model. I call this the nodal loop because you will continue to see this loop in the center of all of the models, right? So this is where it all begins. So these are numbered. The focus is on improving government performance, impact on the size of the economy. So there's a complexity. So there's a pressure to organize government services, expectations from the government, okay, services organization, pressure to move to e-governance, provision for IT-enabled services, so on and so forth. So what is important is here. Transformation is triggered because of complexity. That's the first step that governments have to understand, that they have become too complex to be able to provide service in an efficient manner. Therefore, there is a scope for simplification. So that becomes the trigger to transformation. All right? Moving forward. So as I told you, this is the same loop that you saw in the previous slide, so it is going to stay, but in addition to that, I've added 2 more loops here. All right? This is the loop about using e-governance, using digital government as a way to kickstart the IT industry, the digital economy of the country. And the second thing is to use technology as a capability multiplier. What that means is, if there is a government service which is currently done in a manual fashion, right? If it is automated, it becomes more efficient. It becomes more capable, right? To provide more services to more people, better services to more people. So this is the second loop. That is the second trigger coming from the transformation loop, which came from the previous slide. Third is this. So again, the loop is still there. You see the same loop, right? I'm not building, and the same loop that you saw earlier. Now what I've added here is the one in black on top, which is, what is important is that as governments mature in the adoption of technology to provide services, the country as a whole benefits. Because remember, we have to understand that while governments might believe that they operate in a monopoly, actually that is not true, because governments and countries compete for investments. So if a government can say, I have better service right from the airport, from customs and immigration, if a foreigner is coming in or setting up business, right, there is a greater likelihood that you will bring in more investments. It improves the entire economy of the country. And we all understand that. There is no rocket science in this. All right? However, what will happen is that as architecture comes in, so this is the same loop, you have to realize that there are different ministries, different departments who have their own agendas. I cannot go and tell every ministry in a government saying that all of you have to centralize, all of you have to follow the rules, all of you have to follow the architecture that I designed for you, because different ministries have different agendas. So the agendas will start to diverge, move away. It's very hard for everybody to agree to what you say, right? People have to be convinced. So all of that factors do come in. Now, one of the things about enterprise architecture is standardization, right? Standardization has its benefits, but so if you remember the blocks of architecture which I showed you, you have the strategy, policy, business, data, application, technology, so on and so forth. Now, standardization has its benefits, but it only is relevant at the lower levels of architecture. When you're talking of servers and mainframes, when you're talking of devices, when you're talking of networks, the extent of standardization can be very high. Right? It doesn't matter whether my laptop is a HP or a Lenovo or a whatever other brand, right? As long as it works. It's a commodity. Right? It's like buying vegetables from the grocery store. I mean, all potatoes are same. The only thing that differentiates is the price. It's the same thing with infrastructure. However, as you move up to the business strategy and business process, there is no scope for standardization. Because agencies and ministries operate differently. They have different services. They have different motivations. They have different rationale. Right? Therefore, there is no scope for standardization. So this is important to understand. While standardization is important, it only works at the technology level, not at the business level. All right? Moving forward, as there are diverging agendas, what you will see is that the IT departments operate in their own silo. They don't talk to the business. I think that point came out very well in the previous session in terms of business IT alignment. So I operate my empire. The interesting thing is not only the IT department, the different business departments also have their own empires. I'm Ministry of Health, your Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Transformation. We will not talk to each other. They don't. All right, so the governance becomes very feudalistic by general. I mean, this is not specific to any country or a state, but this is in general across the world. Therefore, to address these issues, the first thing as an architect that you have to think about is looking for friends. Who are the departments, who are the ministries, who are the divisions who are forward thinking, who are willing to take a little bit of risk and saying, hey, you know what, let me go and do a little bit of architecture. You have to find those people, you have to find those ministries in the government who are willing to take that first step and say, let's do this, we'll figure out what happens. Okay? Because the philosophy, the phrase that is very important is that while trying does not guarantee success, not trying guarantees failure. Right? So you have to create that critical mass. Your government may have 100 ministries, right? You may find those 5 ministries and departments who are willing to take that step and show the success. What happens is, because of that, because of those ministries succeeding, it creates something called a bandwagon effect. Do you know what a bandwagon effect is? There are 120 people. I know that if these 2 people succeed, others will immediately say, let me go and become like them. They become the examples. If you identify those 5 ministries in a department that we will do enterprise architecture, as I showed you on my previous slide, there are more ministries who come and say, you know what, I've seen them, they've succeeded, let me go and do it. Human behavior, there is nothing technology in this. This is psychology. All right, so you create something called the bandwagon effect. It improves the success of enterprise architecture in the overall ecosystem, government ecosystem. That's how it looks. Success breeds success, and it creates a brand wagon. I'm using the word branding because once you succeed, you become a brand. Right? Now, slowly, now because you have success stories, you have created that critical mass, you can expand the horizon to cover the entire government. I always say when you do enterprise architecture, you do not boil the ocean, right? Start small, think big. Start with 5 departments, start with 5 ministries, make them successful, and then grow into the rest of the government ecosystem. Once you start becoming big, once you start becoming successful, people will then ask question, what is the ROI? I'm investing so much money in doing enterprise architecture, where is my return on investment? The good thing is once you have success stories, it is easier to measure ROI. You cannot measure ROI if you have already failed, right? It's common sense. And if you are able to show a positive return on investments on your architecture effort, that further feeds into the success of your architecture journey. Because now people are convinced that not only does it help my strategy of the organization, of the government in this case, but it also is reducing cost, it also helping me in making better investment decisions. Of course, what happens as you succeed? What happens? Think about it. You start doing something, you do it well, and then what happens? You are asked to do more. Right? So there is always an element of stretch targets. I may say that I've improved my efficiency of government services by 15%. Great result. Congratulations. Next time you have to increase it by 25%. So there's always an element of stretch targets, right? So the targets keep changing, and this is something that organizations and governments and ministries have to take into consideration. Politics is always important, as I say. As you move up from technology to application to data to business to strategy, things become more and more political. Right? The way a Ministry of Health works is not the same as the way a Ministry of Transportation works, because their nature of business is different. right? So you have to support that diversity. Remember my first word, architects have to support diversity. However, different ministries, different departments, different entities within the organization are interdependent. All right? Yes. This is how standardization should take place. There is always some element of the architecture which can be common across the entire enterprise. In this case, it could be across the entire government, which is basically the technology architecture. Certain aspects of certain aspects of application and data architecture can be specific to cluster, which means that I can find out common data and common application elements for health department, for transportation department, for economic affairs department, etc. Right? Because their nature of business is similar, so they can be clustered together. And at the agency level, I can completely leave them autonomous. The important point is, with architecture, with a tiered approach to architecture, while I take the benefit of economies of scale, I do not centralize everything. This is exactly what federation means that Jerry was talking about. This is the federated approach. It is not a debate between centralization or decentralization. So you see, it balances centralization with decentralization in a tiered manner. Okay. So this is how the full picture looks like. This is a system model. Okay, I've shown you some snapshots of certain areas of the model, but the slide is given to you. It may not be very readable here, but you can always refer back to the slide. So this is the entire system model. What is important is I typically use this to frame something called digital government. What are the different elements of digital government? All of these elements come together in blocks. I'll show you what those blocks are. So on top, as you can see, strategy. I started with strategy. You have the reference models in the different areas. You have service, business, information, application, and technology.